Try to imagine absolutely nothing.
Good luck with that.
Right, yeah. Like, I don't mean a dark, empty room. Close your eyes and mentally delete the room.
Okay.
Now, delete the darkness. Delete space. Delete time. Delete the very concept of deleting.
It's impossible.
Exactly. It's impossible. Your brain just hits a wall.
Hmm.
Well, today we are going to prove that your failure to imagine true nothingness isn't a flaw in your human brain. It's actually a fundamental law of logic.
Yeah, it really is.
You know that classic late night staring at the ceiling question, right? Why is there something rather than nothing?
The ultimate mystery.
Right. And we usually treat it like a detective story. We're searching for a physical cause, or maybe a necessary divine being, or, some random quantum fluctuation that just sparked the universe into existence.
Yeah, that's the standard approach.
But today, we're taking a deep dive into a brilliant philosophical paper that approaches this from a completely different angle. Our mission for this deep dive isn't to figure out why reality isn't nothing. We are exploring a mind-bending prior question. Is pure, absolute nothingness even logically allowed on the menu of reality as a genuine candidate?
I love this because it is a subtle shift, but an incredibly profound one. We are essentially asking to see the metaphysical ID card of nothingness before we even allow it into the building to be debated.
Show me your ID. Nothingness.
Exactly. And what this source material argues is that absolute nothingness might not just be physically absent, but logically disqualified from ever being an option in the first place.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if nothingness isn't even allowed on the menu, that completely changes how we view existence itself.
It really does.
We aren't lucky that the universe exists. We are structurally mandated to exist. But before we logically kick nothingness off the menu of reality, we first have to rigorously define what it is we are actually tasting. Or, well, not tasting.
Right, because in historical philosophical discussions, even among the greats, like Leibniz or Heidegger, people tend to get a little sloppy.
Yeah, they cheat a bit.
They do. They slide from the strongest, most absolute version of nothingness into weaker, everyday substitutes.
Right.
If we are going to test this properly, we have to look at absolute nothingness, defined as the total absence of entities, properties, relations, laws, distinctions, and constraints.
Let's pause there, because I want to make sure you, listening right now, are picturing exactly what we're talking about. When most of us picture nothingness, we picture, like, an empty theater stage.
Sure.
Pitch black, dead quiet. But an empty stage still has dimensions, right?
Yes, it does.
It has a floor.
Yeah.
It has the laws of physics operating within it. Gravity is still pulling on that empty stage.
Precisely. And in our source material, the author makes a critical distinction. They write that appeals to nothingness inherently smuggle in structural conditions unless strictly policed as pure, unconstrained absence.
Pure, unconstrained absence.
That phrase is our absolute target. So we aren't talking about empty space. Empty space is highly structured.
Right, as geometry.
Yeah, a topology, a measurable distance between point A and point B.
And we definitely aren't talking about a quantum vacuum state either, which is, a favorite trope in pop science.
Oh,
You hear physicists say the universe came from nothing, a quantum fluctuation. But, a quantum vacuum is governed by physical laws. It is fluctuating fields of energy.
Right.
That is a very busy, highly regulated kind of nothing.
It is. What's fascinating here is that philosophical appeals to nothingness often cheat. Whether it's the physicist's quantum vacuum or the metaphysician's empty room, they quietly smuggle in these weaker, already structured versions of emptiness.
Because true absence is just too hard to imagine.
Exactly. True, unconstrained absence is completely impossible to mentally grip. We also aren't talking about a world that just lacks physical objects, but still has abstract mathematical truths floating around in the ether.
Like math still exists.
Yeah, like 2 plus 2 equaling 4. That is a rule. Pure absence means zero constraints, zero laws, zero logic governing anything.
Zero rules. Got it. So we have our ultimate, strictest definition of nothingness.
Yeah.
Pure, unconstrained absence.
Right.
But how does any concept, whether it's a universe full of galaxies or a universe full of absolutely zero, qualify as a valid baseline for reality? Like, what makes a state of affairs a genuine candidate to be the total condition of everything?
The paper introduces a very specific hurdle for this called the candidate contrast requirement.
Okay.
For absolutely anything to be a genuine candidate for reality's total condition, there has to be a real determinate contrast between it obtaining, which is just philosopher speak for happening or being the case,
Yeah.
and it not obtaining.
Wait, let me make sure I'm translating the mechanics of that correctly. There has to be a tangible, logically measurable difference between the universe is this way and the universe is not this way.
Exactly.
Like if I say the candidate for reality is a universe entirely made of cheese, the contrast is clear. It either is entirely cheese or it isn't.
You've got it. If there is no real determinate difference between a state of affairs obtaining and not obtaining, then you haven't actually proposed a real candidate for reality.
You're just making noises.
Right, you've just uttered a grammatical placeholder, a string of meaningless syllables. And this strict structural demand sets up what the paper calls the forked argument.
I love a good logical fork. Which way do we go first?
Well, fork 1 proposes that absolute nothingness is simply too indeterminate to count as a genuine candidate.
Okay, meaning what?
The argument here is that pure absence lacks enough definition to create a real contrast between existing and not existing. If it has no constraints, no properties, and no boundaries, there is literally no difference between it being the case and not being the case.
Oh, wow.
So under fork 1, it fails immediately. It never even makes it onto the menu.
But hold on, I'm going to push back hard on fork 1. That feels like a cheap dismissal.
How so?
I mean, we have a phrase for it. I can say the words absolute nothingness right now.
Yeah.
You understand what I mean? If I write it in a dictionary, it has a definition. Doesn't that semantic availability mean it has some sort of determinate existence, at least as a conceptual framework? We can talk about it. We're discussing it right now. So it must be a candidate.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is a crucial trap that human language sets for us.
A trap.
Yeah. Semantic availability, just being able to say the words, is not the same as metaphysical candidacy. Let me give you an example. I can say the phrase, a square circle.
Right.
I can write it down. You understand the individual words. But it doesn't mean a square circle is a real, mathematically possible state of affairs in geometry.
Fair point. Just because my mouth can make the sounds doesn't magically birth a coherent possible universe.
Exactly.
But what about the dictionary argument? If I define nothingness strictly as the absence of all things, doesn't that definition provide the contrast? The contrast is stuff exists versus stuff doesn't exist.
That is exactly where the trap snaps shut. Think about the mechanics of what you just did. You relied on an external dictionary, an external language, an outside human observer to provide the contrast. But remember, we are trying to define the total condition of reality. If you have to rely on an external dictionary or an outside observer to define your total state of reality, then your total state of reality isn't the total state. You've left yourself and your dictionary out of the equation.
Wow, okay. Because the observer me and the conceptual framework I am using exist outside the nothingness.
Yes. The paper explicitly states that a candidate for the total condition of reality must be a candidate in its own right.
Right.
It cannot rely wholly on a meta-language or something outside of itself to pin down its status as obtaining. Because if it is truly the total condition of reality, there is nothing outside of it. The candidate has to ground itself.
That completely invalidates my defense. If I'm not allowed to stand outside the nothingness and point at it, then fork 1 looks pretty grim for the void.
It really does.
But what if the philosophical nihilist fights back? What if they say, fine, I will define it perfectly from the inside. I will make my nothingness perfectly determinate without an external observer. Does that save them? Does taking fork 2 work?
Taking fork 2 is what the paper calls the self-verification step. Let's assume absolute nothingness is determinate enough to count as a candidate.
Right, so it survives fork 1.
Exactly. It stands alone and tries to validate its own status as a real, viable, total state of affairs. And this is exactly where the concept of pure absence logically self-destructs.
Why?
Because if nothingness is going to be a candidate, the case itself must fix its own status. It has to ground its own obtaining. But the very moment it does that, it instantly implicates what the source calls the minimal formal triad.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the act of just standing up and saying, I am a valid candidate, inherently requires a baseline of structure, doesn't it? What is this minimal formal triad?
It is the 3 minimal formal constraints that absolutely any candidate must possess to be considered real. The first is unity.
Unity.
It must be one coherent total condition, not just a fragmented mess of unspecified alternatives. It has to be a single, unified case.
Let me make sure I'm internalizing the mechanics of this. If pure nothingness doesn't have unity, it means it isn't one specific thing. It's just a shattered, nonsensical concept.
Right.
So to be a candidate, it has to adopt the rule of unity. What is the second?
Identity. It must remain stably identical to itself.
Meaning?
It has to be this specific case of nothingness, not shifting endlessly into something else. If it lacks identity, it isn't a determinate candidate.
Wait, let me break that down. If nothingness doesn't possess the rule of identity, it means it has no fixed nature. If it has no fixed nature, it could spontaneously turn into a bowl of petunias or a supernova, right?
Exactly.
So to prevent that from happening, nothingness must establish a rule that says, I must stay nothing.
Yes. And a rule is a constraint.
But pure nothingness isn't allowed to have constraints. That was our strict definition. Pure, unconstrained absence.
Now you see the paradox.
Wow.
And it gets mathematically worse with the third element of the triad factivity. The candidate must possess a real obtains constraint. It has to actually be the case rather than not be the case. To have an obtains status means you possess a binary structure. Yes or no, true or false.
Right.
But absolute nothingness cannot possess binary structure. Yet, to even apply for the job of reality, you have to wear these three constraints: unity, identity, factivity.
It's like trying to join an exclusive club for people who absolutely hate rules and refuse to follow any structural guidelines whatsoever.
Yeah.
But to get in, you have to sign a formal 10-page charter, pay your monthly dues, and wear a club badge at all times. The very act of applying ruins your qualification for the club. You are disqualified the second you sign the paperwork.
That is a perfect analogy. The paper points out that by merely fulfilling the minimal formal constraints required to just be a candidate for reality, absolute nothingness ceases to be unconstrained.
It defeats itself.
Yes. Pure absence defeats itself simply by trying to get on the menu.
If you are listening to this on your commute right now and your brain is doing backflips, take a breath, because mine is too. This is wild. The universe defaults to minimal structure just by virtue of being a possible state of affairs.
Truly.
Pure nothingness is choked out by the mere logic of candidacy.
It is a fatal contradiction. If it has no structure, it's not a candidate. If it has enough structure to be a candidate, it is no longer absolute nothingness. It's a structured state possessing unity, identity, and factivity.
Okay, so mere candidacy requires a baseline of structure. But what happens when we demand that our ontology, our theory of reality, actually does something?
Right.
Like when we move from just having a theoretical candidate sitting there in the dark to a world we can coherently describe and interact with.
That is the second major articulation in the paper. It's the transition to non-trivial description.
Non-trivial description.
Yeah. Being a candidate is one thing, but if an ontology is going to support coherent content rather than just empty, vacuous mentions, it has to shoulder a heavier structural burden.
Makes sense.
A world that can be described needs more scaffolding than a world that merely obtains.
And the paper maps out what this heavier scaffolding looks like.
It does. It emerges as a recurring three-role structural requirement. First, you need stable reference.
Okay. What does that do?
You need a way to track what is actually being described over time. Otherwise, the descriptive content just drifts into meaningless noise. Imagine trying to point at a blur that constantly changes shape. You can't describe it.
Right.
Second, you need differentiation.
Yeah.
You have to be able to distinguish between reference so they don't all just collapse into one undifferentiated blob.
Stable reference.
Yeah.
Differentiation. Let me try to guess the logical third step.
Go for it.
If you have stable things you can refer to and you can tell them apart, you still just have a scattered, disconnected pile of concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So you need a way to relate them to each other, right?
Yeah.
Some sort of boundary or relational structure.
You hit the nail on the head. The paper calls it integrative closure.
Integrative closure.
This means bringing those differentiated reference into a constrained related structure. It can't just be a random infinite list of things floating in the void. They have to relate in a way that forms a coherent ontology.
Okay.
So that's stable reference, differentiation, and integrative closure.
Now, looking at these two sets of rules,
Mm-hmm.
the minimal formal triad from before and this new three-role structural requirement, are they related?
Yes.
Is this new burden just unity, identity, and factivity wearing a fake mustache? Like, is unity just integrative closure in disguise? Or is this something entirely new?
It's a brilliant question, and the source material is very careful here. It's not identical vocabulary, and it's not just a cheap relabeling. The author describes it as a structural continuity.
So it's the same core thing.
It is the exact same fundamental burden, just articulating itself at a higher level of demand.
So the demands literally scale up based on what we are asking reality to do.
Exactly. When you ask reality to just be a candidate, you get unity, identity, and factivity. But when you ask reality to support coherent description, the triad evolves.
How so?
Identity scales up into stable reference. Factivity scales up into differentiated reality. And unity scales up into integrative closure. The overarching inescapable rule here is that pure absence yields to minimal structure the absolute moment you demand anything from it. Structure is inevitable.
That logic feels bulletproof. The heavier the descriptive lift, the more scaffolding you need.
Yeah.
But this brings up a massive historical elephant in the room.
Huh.
If this logic is so sound, if absolute nothingness is a literal impossibility that destroys itself the second it tries to exist, why do so many incredibly smart philosophers throughout history believe they can easily imagine an empty world?
Well, they usually rely on a mental exercise known as the subtraction argument.
Oh, I have definitely done this one. For you listening, try this thought experiment right now. Look at the universe and just start mentally removing things.
Take away the galaxies.
Then remove the stars, then the planets. Erase the molecules, the atoms, the quantum fields, the photons. Keep subtracting until you're left with absolutely zero objects.
Right. And defenders of metaphysical nihilism, the idea that there could have been nothing, argue that this human subtraction process proves an empty world is a coherent, possible, total state of affairs.
Because you can picture taking it all away.
Exactly, because you can imagine taking things away one by one. They claim the endpoint absolute zero must be valid.
But based on everything we've just discussed about external frameworks,
Yeah.
that feels like a massive psychological trick.
It is.
It's like erasing all the dry erase marker off a whiteboard and proudly claiming you've created pure absence. You haven't created pure absence. You just have a highly structured whiteboard with zero ink on it.
Right.
You still have the dimensions of the board, the material it's made of, the room it's sitting in, and most importantly, you are still standing there holding the eraser.
That is exactly the paper's critique. The subtraction argument creates a description of emptiness from the outside. You, the human thinker, are standing safely outside the theoretical universe, mentally plucking items out of a container. But the paper rigorously argues that generating a description from the outside does not prove that the resulting emptiness can stand alone as a self-verifying total condition.
Because once you remove the thinker and you remove the conceptual container, the nothingness has to ground itself. And we already proved it mathematically and logically.
Yeah.
Can't do that without putting on the constraints of unity, identity, and factivity. It needs a whiteboard to exist on.
This raises an important question, which is how defenders of nothingness respond when you back them into this inescapable logical corner.
Oh, I bet they don't like it.
They don't. Usually, when pressed on the impossibility of absolute unconstrained absence, they realize they are losing and retreat to deflationary definitions.
Inflationary definitions. You mean they start moving the goalposts?
They do. They'll say, well, okay, maybe it's not absolute pure nothingness. By nothingness, I just mean a world with no concrete physical objects or a world with no contingent beings, even if mathematical laws still exist.
Which completely gives up the game.
It is a coherent retreat, but as the paper points out, it is a glaring admission of defeat regarding the original question. The strongest concept of absolute nothingness simply cannot bear the structural weight of being a foundational candidate.
Right.
The moment you define it strictly, it collapses under the logical requirements of just trying to be a valid option.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive with the desire to explain why there is something rather than nothing.
Yeah.
It's a question that can make you feel small, like human existence, and the entire cosmos is this incredibly lucky, fragile accident that somehow managed to conquer an infinite, terrifying void.
Yeah.
But what we've discovered through this rigorous philosophical logic is that absolute nothingness was never actually a valid option to begin with.
It is a total paradigm shift. You don't have to explain how the universe magically conquered the void because the void itself is a logical contradiction. Structure isn't an accident. It is the inescapable baseline of existence.
The universe defaults to minimal structure, unity, identity, factivity, simply by virtue of being a possible state of affairs. Nothingness couldn't even fill out the paperwork to apply for the job of reality without violating its own nature.
Exactly.
It's such an incredible aha moment for anyone who loves thinking about reality. We exist not because we beat the astronomical odds against nothingness, but because nothingness never even had a seat at the table.
And while this philosophical proof doesn't automatically explain the complex physics of our specific universe, it doesn't derive the speed of light or geometry or gravity, it guarantees that something structured had to be the case. The absolute zero point of reality isn't zero, it's structure.
Which leaves you with a pretty profound lingering thought to chew on as you go about your day. If the universe itself didn't have a choice but to possess minimal structure, I mean, if unity and identity are literally unavoidable baselines of reality, what else in your life or in human society do you currently view as a fragile, lucky coincidence when it might actually be a structural inevitability? Keep questioning the baseline.